Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome back for our final day of the summer school. We have today here for our final keynote speech of our summer school, Marco Giugni from the University of Geneva. I think there is no need for me to present him. Most of you are familiar with his work. Actually, today is going to present something that I think resonates with the research interest of many of you, somehow wrapping up a long wave of study of social movements in the era of globalization, presenting material mainly deriving from the latest book he has published together with Maria Grasso, based on a long strand of protest surveys and other different kind of data. I think it's going to be an interesting piece also for our discussion. The format is the same you're already familiar with. There will be a presentation by Marco, and then we'll have also time before 12:30 for a Q&A. Okay, I give the floor to Marco.
On? Now is it on? Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me at your summer school. You're always doing a great job, I think, in organizing all these events. I don't know how you can manage to do this, but you do. I saw we have plenty of time. We have 2.5 hours or 2 hours, let's say. I don't think I would need all this time. At the same time, I'm not sure how long my presentation will be. It's a bit flexible. I sort of tested it in Lausanne a few weeks ago, also in a doctoral school, and it was like 1 hour, but without the tables that I added and that I will maybe try to show you, although I'm not sure because there's a lot of numbers and you risk to get lost. I get myself lost in the tables we have in the book. As Lorenzo said, actually, what I would like to do today is to present some findings from a recent book I wrote with Maria Grasso from the University of Sheffield, with whom I collaborate since a few years on many different things. So it's also the opportunity for me to do some self-promotion, I would say. So, and if you want to buy the book, you can always buy it. It just came out, actually. In fact, the origin of this book and of my presentation goes back, I think, in about 10 years ago. As Lorenzo hinted at, there was a project based on protest survey. I don't know if you might have looked at protest survey as one of the methods in the school, so you know what it's about, although I will say a few words. And this is the project which was called CCC, Caught in the Act of Contestation. I think that was the title of the project. It was a project led by Bert Klandermans, formally led by Bert Klandermans, also substantially. But substantially, the project was coordinated by Bert Klandermans, Jacqueline van Stekelenburg, and Stéphane Valgrave. And I was responsible for the Swiss case. Originally, we had, I think, 5 countries included, and then a few other countries joined the project in a second step. And this project actually produced lots of findings and results. Many of them have been written actually by the leading teams, the teams around Bert Klandermans and the one around Stéphane Valgrave. They published wonderful papers in different journals. Maria and myself organized an edited book also summarizing some of the findings a few years ago, I think in 2015. But a couple of years ago when we started to work on the book, we thought there's a lot of findings on different specific aspects, but there's no comprehensive overview, let's say, of the project and of the findings of this project. So we decided, after consulting actually with Bert and Stéphane and Jacqueline, we thought that we could write such an overall overview. And I took advantage of a sabbatical in 2017, I have to say, to write half of this book. Maria wrote the other half without being in sabbatical, but she's a woman, so she can work more, I think, at least than me. So I'd like to present some of the findings. The book, I don't think the book actually has a main argument. It's more, well, let's take some aspects that have been studied in the field of social movement research, especially concerning protest participation at the individual level. And let's try to see whether today, or which are today the characteristics of those people who protest, and in particular who participate in demonstrations, because actually the main methodology is based on data collection on demonstrations, on a high number of demonstrations, I have to say. I think it covers like 70 demonstrations in these different countries I mentioned, or these 5 or more countries. With a full sample of about 15,000 respondents, so which is good. So we have different chapters that tackle different aspects, and I will tell a little bit more in a while. But I'd like to take a step backward and maybe try to, just a matter of introduction, to start from something you know very well, I suppose, which is the different levels of analysis that traditionally students of social movements have been addressing. And I think we can take the standard distinction between macro, meso, and micro levels of analysis. Each level of analysis actually focuses on a specific aspect and has some key methodologies that are or have been and still are used. For example, at the macro level, what you're looking at is actually protest or mobilization processes, if you will. And one of the main methodology, which I also think you have studied in this week or in these 10 days, is protest event analysis, which then spilled, I think, Martin, you had the class on protest event analysis, which at some point became or developed in what is called political claims analysis. So you know what it's about, and I'm not talking about this actually, and we are not using this method in the book. The second level is the meso level, which is also often used, and we are actually now also working in a project in which Lorenzo Bos is also involved on political participation of young people on the organizational level. So these are the organization or small groups dynamics. And the methodology, although this is a sort of catch-all word that doesn't mean much, I would say, it's organizational analysis. But of course, you have different ways. I don't know if you had also lectures on how to study social movement organizations. Probably yes, probably no. But anyway. And the third one is the micro level, which is the one I'm dealing here today, and the one in which we apply actually in the book. The main object, of course, is individuals. So how, when, and whether, first of all, people participate in protest activities. Of course, you can also study protest participation in relation to other forms of participation, including voting, and I will tell you something about this. And the two main methodologies, I would say, is one, surveys, and secondly, interviews, which more or less are distinguished in terms of quantitative versus qualitative approaches, although I don't like this distinction very much, I have to say. It's a bit obsolete, I think. The use of surveys to study social movements. Of course, when you talk about surveys, you have different, as you've seen in your lecture about surveys. You've certainly had one. You have, I would say, 3 different kinds of surveys. So you might have 3 different kinds of surveys. One is what we can call general surveys, that is existing surveys like the European Social Survey, for example, or any other of this kind, electoral studies as well. I mean, national election surveys, polls and surveys. Here you can, the advantage of this kind of surveys is that you can compare participants with non-participants. This is important actually, not per se, but it's important to say this in relation to the protest survey data, which is a bit different in this respect. The disadvantage is probably that you have to deal with declared participation, and in particular with past participation or potential participation. You know, if you are familiar with these surveys, you know there is the standard question, in the last 12 months, for example, have you participated in one or more of then a battery of, I don't know, it ranges from 5 to 20 or something kinds of political activities. This actually comes from the traditional studies in political participation, such as Barnes and Case and Sidney Verba and other prominent scholars. Potential participation is that you ask, would you be ready to take part in a demonstration or to any other kinds of, including voting again, of course. One of the disadvantages is that for social movement analysis, you often have few variables because, of course, these are not tailor-made surveys. They are surveys that exist, so we have sort of fit your theoretical framework to the data that exist out there. So it's useful, it's helpful, and in the book, actually, we use the European Social Survey in one of the chapters, I have to say, but it's quite limited, I would say. And only ex post, I don't remember why I put this, but anyway. The second kind of service is what we can call ad hoc or specific service or tailor-made service. The service that you made yourself because you have your research questions, you have your theoretical framework, and like we do, for example, in our projects or in any other project, for that matter, you construct your questionnaire based on your theoretical idea, which is much better. Of course, it's more costly because you have to pay a company, for example, to carry out the survey. Again, here you can compare participants and non-participants, which is very important. And of course, all the tradition of political participation studies, and also in the social movement field, this is one of key aspects because you want to compare, to explain why people participate. You want to compare those who participate with those who don't participate, and this is essential, I would say. Again, here you have to rely on past participation or potential, but the advantage is that you can include as many variables, more or less as many variables as you wish, because you create your own questionnaire, of course. Both kinds of survey data are used in research, and they have their limitation. And there is a third kind of survey which is more recent, and as I know you have also looked at this, you have what is called protest surveys. These are methodologies that have been developed, I would say, in the past 20 years, which focus on participants only, which is an important aspect actually to keep in mind, because of course when you focus on participants only, you sort of select on a dependent variable, so you cannot test hypotheses about why people participate, because you don't compare with those who don't participate. So The advantage, on the other hand, is that you don't rely on past participation, or not only on past participation or the potential, the propensity to participate, but you are capturing actual participants. So you are studying people, as the title of the project I mentioned tells, caught in the act of contestation or in act of protesting, which is a big advantage, actually. It has many advantages related to that. I'm not going into the detail. Maybe in the question and answer section we can specify a little bit. Another advantage, again, is that you can construct your own if you don't use existing data. Like the ones I'm using, actually now they are public, they can be used by anyone. But if you construct your own questionnaire, you can use specific variables. And also, this kind of methodology has another advantage, which I think is key for what we've done in the book, which is that you can rely on larger samples of respondents. Why? Because actually, as you know, people who demonstrate or people who protest is a small minority, I would say, of the population. Of course, depends on the kind of participation, depends on the form of participation. But protesting in general is made by a minority of people, which makes general surveys and even specific surveys, which usually are based on a sample which is not so large, not so helpful if you want to break down the characteristic of those who participate. This is what you can do with the protest survey data. As I said, in our sample, for example, we have 15,000 participants, which is important in itself for example, doing statistical analysis, because as you know, if you are familiar with statistical analysis, the larger the sample, the higher the probability that you find significant effects of your variables, which is good. But this is not the main advantage, I would say. The main advantage that you can break down and you can disaggregate actually protest, which is quite rarely done in the literature. And I think this is one of the main thrusts or the main goals actually of what we've done in the project and then in the book. So the protest survey methods, quickly, because you've seen this, studies people while protesting, usually, at least so far, in street demonstrations. You can rely on larger samples of protesters. Of course, not necessarily if you only study one single demonstration. For example, in our analysis, for a single demonstration, we have sample size ranging, I think, from 200 to maybe 3-something hundred, so which is not much. But if you aggregate and you add more demonstration as we did, you come up with larger samples. So allows to study in more detail the features of protest. And I think this is very important because, of course, this has been done in the literature and social movements. What are the features of protest and of protesters? But most often this has been done based on single case studies, which is not bad in itself, but it doesn't really allow to generalize beyond that specific case. So I think this methodology is important also for this reason. On the other hand, as I said, you must keep in mind that in all what I will say, you should hear it that keeping in mind that you have no information on those who do not participate. So again, you cannot actually test hypotheses about participation versus non-participation because you only have the one, you don't have the zero if you want. So does not allow to explain participation versus non-participation. And another final, more technical, I would say, shortcoming of this methodology is that unlike traditional surveys, which are based on a long history of creating representative samples developed by statisticians, here it's harder actually to create a representative sample. You can only approximate what we or statisticians call a representative sample. And one of the ways that have been developed actually by Stefan Valgrave and also other people actually in other places as well, but this specific methodology has been developed by Stefan Valgrave's team, is to implement a specific way to distribute questionnaires during demonstrations. And this methodology actually has also been recently applied in March 15 when a team of researchers in different countries have surveyed actually the climate strike demonstrations from the first, it was not the first probably, it was the second, climate strike demonstration in March 15. So the idea is actually that you want to cover, I'm not going into the detail because this is methodology, so you want to cover the whole demonstration by first estimating how many people you have in the demonstration, then counting how many rows, so estimating how many rows you have, which allows you to say, okay, if I want to distribute, let's say, 1,000 questionnaires, of course, I don't want to distribute them all in a section of the demonstration. Otherwise, you didn't cover the whole demonstration. So you want to cover all demonstration. There is a specific technique to do this, actually, which is not so complicated, but I'm not going to deal into this. This is only to say, actually, that this is how we collected the data I'm now talking about and which we studied in our research, in the CCC project, and then we reported the results in this. So now to the study and to the book. This book has been written actually as any other book, I would say, and any other study which is done in the framework of a specific context relating namely to protest and political participation more generally. And this context has a number of key features, I would say, and here I mentioned 4 of them, which we outline in introduction and which pose the basis for interpreting what we are doing later on. The first element of the context is that we are, as some researchers have stressed very much, since a few years now, or even decades, I would say, in the context of the emergence of a new cleavage between the so-called winners and losers of globalization. Here I refer mainly to the work, for example, by Hans-Peter Krisi, Sven Hutter, and other colleagues, which have been working very much on this kind of transformation of the political space. Actually, Krisi's argument is that we have witnessed in the last few years to a transformation of the political space with the emergence of new cleavages in plural, but especially this new cleavage between those who suffer and who are subject to the changes brought by globalization, and those that can take those who see and can take the opportunities. So these are the winners. And this actually is it's a kind of cleavage that has been and is being very much used, for example, in studies of populism, but not only. And we think actually that is also important, as the works by Sven Hutter basically shows. It's also important to understand the transformation of protest participation, of social movements more generally, but more specifically of protest participation as we study in the book. The second element of the context is something that students of political participation know very well, which is this deepening, and which is also related probably, I think actually all these 4 are interrelated to some extent. But it's related to the first one. The deepening disaffection of citizens from traditional representative politics and democracy. So there is a decreasing, and data show this very well, there is a decreasing mistrust in political institutions and in democracy. Not in democracy as such, but in traditional representative democracies, which has brought also students of social movements to focus on participatory forms and deliberative forms of democracy and things like that. Actually, today she's not here, but Donatella Della Porta, who works here, of course, has worked very much in this field as well. There is a third aspect of the context which we think it's important to understand how protest participation has changed in the past 2 or 3 decades, let's say, is the rise of new forms of political participation. Obviously, I'm thinking about online forms because since, I would say, the mid-2000s, we have at our disposal, or protesters have at their disposal, online tools that they didn't have before. So, and this, of course, is potentially changing the ways protest is first organized, and secondly, it's implemented, I would say. Whether these are for the good or for the bad, I think it's open to discussion, and maybe we can discuss this later on. I'm a bit critical as compared to some of my colleagues, I would say, on the use of online forms. But I'm also thinking about other developments and the emergence of other forms of political participation. And here I'm referring mostly at what is mostly known as political consumerism, and broadly to what researchers called everyday life or lifestyle politics, if you want. So these are forms that are more individualized, although they have a collective dimension behind, but it's more individualized way. So the third change or macrostructural change, I would say, that characterized the context of our study is this emergence of these more individualized forms of participation. It's also a way to get away from the more traditional means of participation, I would say. Of course, as I would try to show, there are many differences and variations across countries in all these aspects, actually. The emergence and the impact of the winners-loser globalization is different in different countries, as much as the deepening disaffection of citizens from traditional politics. It's stronger in some countries than in others, probably also related to the last point, which is the economic crisis. And at the same time, these individualized forms of protest are much more widespread in some countries, mainly in Northern Europe, than, for example, in Southern Europe, like here in Italy. And the fourth and last aspects I just mentioned, which is also forms the context for our study, is the economic crisis that was actually at its peak, I would say, when we gathered the data. The data we gathered actually, if I remember correctly, it's written somewhere in the book, I think, well, I hope at least, it was between 2009 to 2012. So that was really the time of the economic crisis. Again, the economic crisis has touched different countries at different levels, different moments perhaps, but this is something that characterized the context. And for us, actually, the economic crisis has an important feature of an important impact, which is what we call here the remobilization of old redistributive issues. Here I'm referring explicitly to the distinction in the social movement literature between old and new issues, or old and new social movements. Those old labor movement that focuses on economic aspects, basically, on redistributive aspects, and the so-called new social movements, which focuses more on lifestyle, politics, or everyday life politics, if you will, more cultural aspects as well. In the book, actually, we also criticize, one of the main arguments in the book is actually that this distinction, and I've been writing this also elsewhere, I have to say, we sort of criticize this strong distinction between old and new movements. But at the same time, we are using it. So maybe we can discuss. Maybe we are schizophrenic. I don't know. Hopefully not. So we are using this distinction because we think it has some importance. But we also think that this distinction has been exaggerating the differences that you observe between new and old social movements, old and new social movements. So this is the context of the study. What is the we can call it assumption. Well, I wrote it actually literally as we have it in the book here. The assumption, or probably this can also be seen as the main argument. I told you before, we don't have a main overall argument, but maybe as an afterthought, I could say this could be the main argument we have. So, and the assumption, if we keep this word, is that the contours of protest participation, or the characteristics of protest participations, and in particular participation in street demonstration, which is the focus of the book, have changed as a result of large-scale processes and structural changes, the ones that I mentioned before, brought about by globalization. So we are in this stream of studies that try to see what are the effects of globalization, not on voting, not on other aspects of society or politics, but on protest participation. So the contours of protest participation have changed as a result of large-scale processes and structural changes brought about by globalization, and more recently catalyzed by the economic crisis, as well as by the politicization of such processes and changes by recent social movements. So we think actually that the changes that one observes in the characteristic of protest participation, and if you will, more broadly in social movements characteristics, can be linked to these two processes, one more institutional / political, and I would say / cultural globalization, and one more, I would say, more specific related to the economic crisis. And this is what we try to show, actually, and I will also try to come back to this in my conclusions. Why did we study street demonstration? Well, first of all, that was decided in the project, so these were the data that we had at our disposal, so that's why we use this in the book. But there is a more fundamental reason, actually, as students of social movements have been showing and arguing, street demonstrations still are the most typical form of contention in the modern, what Tilly would have called the modern action repertoires. I would say together with the strike, the petition. If you are familiar with the work of Charles Tilly, for example, you know that these are the main, along with elections, these are the main forms of participation or characteristic of movements that have been brought about with the emergence of the modern action repertoire. So this is what someone like Sidney Taro, for example, has called the modular form of contentious politics. That is, or participation, if you prefer this word. This is the form of mobilization that is used by many different groups on many different issues, which is what distinguishes actually the modern action repertoire to the old repertoire as depicted in the work by Tilly. It's also the form, what some call the normalized form of contentious politics. So I will come back to this in a while. There is this idea of a normalization, actually, of protest participation, which some scholars, like, for example, Pippa Norris, Russell Dalton, and others, Stefan Valgrave himself, have been stressing. So that's why we study demonstration, and we think that by looking at the characteristics and at the characteristic of participants in demonstrations, we capture a good bunch of what we call protest politics, in spite of what I said, the emergence of new forms and so on and so on. So the objective of our analysis is, I would say, threefold. One is to study who demonstrates, so based on a large sample, as I said, of demonstrators, why they demonstrate and how they engage in politics. This is actually where the main goals of the research project. Again, of course, we need to pay attention to the fact that we have not the non-participants, so we must ask the good questions and give the good answers, hopefully. A second objective of the study was to show cross-national variations in those characteristics. We wanted to show how, which is done in the literature, of course. We are not inventing anything in the book, I would say, but we are trying to build on what has been done and try to go a step further, if only by the fact that we have such a large sample on different countries, on different demonstrations, and we think the value of the study, if any, will be there. So to show cross-national variations, but the most important, and I will stress very much this aspect in the rest of the presentation, the most important goal is what I mentioned earlier, to disaggregate protest. And this is something that I really think has not been done, at least not been done sufficiently in the literature, social movements. By disaggregating protest, I mean not to treat protesters as they were a block, a uniform block of people, but to acknowledge something which is totally reasonable, I think. Say that there are different profiles of people protesting. There are different characteristics from people protesting in demonstrations, namely. There are those people who are more frequent protesters, for example, and there are other people that they go from time to time to a demonstration, for example. So that's the main idea, I think, behind the... So this leads us actually to do three types of comparisons in our analysis. One is across countries, and here you see the countries that have been included in the study. And the data set also include the Czech Republic, but we excluded the Czech Republic from our analysis to sort of homogenize at least the field of comparison. So we decided not to take that country, also because our knowledge of that country is much lower than the other. More or less, we know something about all these other countries that you see here, but we didn't know anything about the Czech Republic, former communist, so more difficult. Across countries, comparison across issues of demonstration, and here we use this distinction between what the literature is often called the old and new social movements, or old and new issues, and here we call it actually cultural versus economic issues. And I have to stress that actually we included anti-austerity protests in the economic category. I acknowledge that as any other categorization, especially when it's binary, it's to some extent a bit arbitrary, and you simplify a much complex reality. Some of the demonstration we call economic, they also have some cultural dimensions and vice versa. But still, we think that the main distinction can be used, and we've used this in the. And the third one is across types of demonstrators. Researchers have been some researchers, including Lorenzo, actually Lorenzo Bossi has done work on this as well. They have been proposing categorizations or typology of demonstrators. Here we simplify very much by distinguishing between what we call occasional and what we call the activist. Of course, activist is a term that we use in many different ways. And actually, activist actually is someone who participates more or less systematically to demonstrations. She or he has been, when we interviewed the person, she or he have been involved previously in many demonstrations before. So it's a regular, maybe occasional and regular would have been a better term, I don't know. And occasional is someone that goes from time to time. Actually, in this case, occasional is what Valgrave has called, Valgrave and Ruud Wouters have called the first-timers, people that are there for the first time. Of course, you don't know, they might become activists afterwards, but we cannot see the future yet, so unfortunately. So it's a way of simplifying a more complex concept, which is the one that I said, or a more complex idea, which is the one based on the willingness to disaggregate protest. These are the research questions that we try to address in the book, and we also try to address today. So, first of all, what is the protest potential in Europe and how it has developed over time? Of course, if we want to understand the characteristic of those who protest, first we need to know what is the potential for protest in different countries and how it varies across countries. So if only to have a reference point to understand and to interpret what we find among protesters, we still need. It's a way to put a little bit of this zero that I mentioned before, the non-participants. So we have a chapter 2 actually, where we're using existing survey data, European Social Survey. We try to show the potential for participation in different forms and also to grasp this idea of the disaffection from politics. Then there are the research questions relating to demonstrators and to the protest survey data. So who protest? Who are people who protest? What are their characteristics? What are the protesters' social, structural, and class bases? Again, of course, we build on solid ground because the literature on social movements have been studying this for years. But again, often based on case studies and rarely, although some works exist, rarely based on systematic comparative data, and this is what we wanted to do. So who protests? What are the characteristics? What is the relationship of protesters with institutional politics? We have a full chapter on this. This is a very important matter, I would say. This is one of the key, in my view at least, issues of debate within the literature, the relationship between electoral and non-electoral, or institutional and non-institutional, or electoral and contentious politics. How do they relate? Are they one against the other? Is there a complementarity? Is there a competition between these two forms? So we tackle also this aspect, and I will show you some findings, or I will summarize some findings, let's say. Another very important aspect that has been studied in the social movement literature, which you know very well because you are, I suppose, all students of social movements, is the role of networks or pre-existing ties. And we could not leave this out, of course. So we wanted to see how well embedded are protesters in social networks, and also the question of recruitment. How were protesters or demonstrators recruited? How they get to know about the demonstrations. These are some of the questions we have in the question actually. How they get to know the demonstration, were they recruited through interpersonal networks, people they know? Are they recruited from people who are already activists or members of organizations? Or are they recruited more by the media, for example, including the social media, the new forms of communication? And of course, this is something that is important in general, but what we wanted to give as a plus, I would say, as an additional added value probably, is that we started from the assumption that perhaps, or we hypothesize, although we don't do it formally, but we hypothesize that the role of networks and recruitment channels is different for different kinds of participants in demonstrations. This is actually the main argument of the whole story, I would say. What we are trying to do and what we are trying to show, beyond the fact of consolidating some previous finding in the social movement literature, which we do, I think, it's to show that if we go a step further, we can see that not only the characteristics of participants in demonstrations varies, that is, there is an heterogeneity of people demonstrating. That's the idea of the normalization of protesters that, for example, Valgraf, Pipanoris have been stressing, actually. But secondly, and most importantly, I would say, the explanatory factors explaining participation also vary depending on who we are looking at. So this is the main idea. Obviously, and at this point I should stress this aspect, our dependent variable, I know I can use this word in a method context, school. The dependent variable is not the fact on having participated, because we don't have the non-participants. So we sort of escape from that by operationalizing the dependent variable as the strength of commitment to participate. So what we are explaining is the strength of commitment, the determination that people have to participate. So, and we look at different degrees of determination. Now, this is important to keep in mind. So how well embedded are protests in social networks, and how did this network factor vary across countries, across issues of demonstrations, and also especially across types of demonstrators? And then we tackled another important aspect, which has to do with what some now call predispositions. I was in Geneva, as always, because I work in Geneva, a few weeks ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, and Doug McAdam, an author you certainly know, came to give a lecture, and I gave a lecture actually on the role of predispositions. And actually, it was very interesting, just a parenthesis, it was very interesting because if you know the works by McAdam, he has been working a lot on the role of network, the previous factor, the role of interpersonal networks, and actually now is sort of, at least that was my understanding of what he said, is that he's sort of saying, well, listen, we have paid too much attention to networks and we overstated the importance of networks, and actually we forgot that predispositions, political attitudes if you prefer this term, predispositions are also, and perhaps are even more important. He has a nice study, he has a small panel study on students enrolled in Eastern University in Stanford. And he follows actually the people over time, over the course of study, 5 years or something. And it was quite convincing, actually. But anyway, I close the parenthesis. Here we are studying what we call the cognitive and affective predisposition. So we wanted to use this more general term of predisposition, but actually we are looking at the role of political attitudes like trust, efficacy, political interest, all these things that we know very well. And we wanted to know what social movement scholars have been starting to do since a few years, the role of emotions. We don't have much about emotions, and I have to say I'm not a fan of emotions. Well, I mean, I have emotions, but as an object of study, I'm not a fan. But we have a few indicators that we try to use. And so, you know the literature, so scholars of social movements, starting from Jim Jaspers, but not only, many others, are trying to, I think, they are trying to argue that emotions have been neglected, and that's important. I myself actually wrote, with Donatella Laporta, I wrote a chapter in a book on emotions. So everything is possible, you know. Finally, the mother of all questions, of course, why do people protest? What motivates people to protest? We are also tackling the issue of motivations. What are the motivations for people to protesting? Social psychologists, Bert Klandermans and many others, have been doing this for years, but again, not, first of all, in such a systematic way, I would say, and not so much on looking whether and how different motivations, different kinds of motivation to protest can vary across countries, but mainly and most importantly across movements, because the distinction between issues actually is a distinction between different movements. Very simplified, all the new economic and cultural, but the main idea is that we need to distinguish different movements, and perhaps the mechanisms, the dynamics at work in different movements are different. And third, across types of demonstrators, as I said, the famous occasional versus the regular, or the activists. These are the research questions which are summarized in this sort of, we call it conceptual framework. I don't know if it is a conceptual framework. It is a framework. I don't know if it's conceptual. But anyway, so we took inspiration, I think, from a similar scheme that Bert Klandermans has in a book, an old book is written on the protest, the social psychology of protest. We have the mobilizing context, so the potential, protest potential. This is the chapter using the ESS data, looking at the population and see what is the population, the potential within this population for protesting. And then we distinguish between two different sets of factors or aspects. The microstructural dynamics, where we deal with social structural basis of protest participation or participation in demonstrations. The mobilizing structures, networks, and the question about, here is a bit stretching maybe to call these microstructural dynamics, but anyway, the relation between institutional and non-institutional politics, or electoral and non-electoral politics amongst demonstrations, again. And then the third aspect is the social psychological dynamics, predisposition, affective and cognitive, so emotions and attitudes, and then the motivations. And there is underlying a sort of, big quotes, causal idea that the first causes or influences the second and influences the third. We also tried, but this is not the main aspects in our study, we also tried to make sense at least of the countries that we had. Here I have to say, but don't tell anyone, that we had to struggle a lot. Why? Because we couldn't choose our countries. Of course, we could have selected among the existing countries, but the data were there, so we had to select. We had to find a way to make sense, and we sort of took inspiration from the literature on political opportunity structures, which is probably still the most helpful when it comes to classify countries in terms of how they then might affect the characteristic of protest. So we actually took two dimensions. I'm not going into the detail here because it's not the main idea. The strength of the state is what some others call the openness or closedness of the formal structures of the state. This goes back to Kitchell, actually, this idea of weak, strong, or open and closed states. And the second one is it's more it's an aspect that has been stressed very much in the work by Hans-Peter Crisi, but not only. Also Donatella Della Porta has worked on this. Well, she's worked on everything. So low and high. The availability of the class cleavage. So the salience, I would say, the salience of the class cleavage, and how this makes a potential available to be mobilized. And we sort of classify the countries here. Maybe I can only stress one thing, which is the fact that we could classify the two southern European countries, Italy, Spain, more or less together, which is actually quite nice in terms of the findings that we have, because we often found actually similar characteristics on different aspects among these two countries as opposed to the other countries. Now, I'm not saying that these similarities explained, for sure, not entirely, but perhaps not even at all, by this. But this was a way to make sense of that. Okay. How much time I have left? Huh? Do I have time? Huh? Half an hour? It doesn't matter if you I see them already a little bit. But anyway, I'm trying to now give you some of the findings that we have. The first one is simply based on the ESS, so that's not very original. So I'm just stressing a few things that we describe actually in this chapter 2 in the book. First of all, as I said, we saw important cross-national variations in political participation. People participate politically. Some do, some others don't. The aggregate level of participation varies also across countries, probably due to political opportunity structures, but also to traditions, to cultural differences, whatever you want. There is also variations not only in the political participation, but also in associational involvement. Again, you have different traditions in different countries. In some countries, associations are very important. In other countries, are less important, and so on. There are differences across countries in political values and political attitudes. I give you here some of the figures. We actually looked at the data from 2002 to 2014. Although we also have more recent data available in the ESS, and we can see that, for example, having taken part in demonstration, which is the most important aspect for us, goes up to 20%, 21% in Spain, and it ranges from that to the minimum country is the Netherlands with 3%, so big difference. Which means that in terms of technical, methodological terms, if you analyze the data pooled, as we do actually in our, some of the analysis which I won't show, you must take this difference into account, of course. But there are techniques that you all know. We also looked at the satisfaction with how democracy works in country, or in the respondent's country, and there we also found differences. Again, we found much skepticism in the southern countries, especially in Italy, and a much more favorable view in the northern countries, and also in Switzerland. I'm Swiss, so the Swiss are often very happy with how Swiss democracy works. We have direct democracy, which we are very proud of, I have to say. So that's normal to be happy, perhaps, although there are people that are not happy at all as well. And what we found also is differences in trust in country parliament. Again, very low trust in Spain, very low trust in UK as well, and even more in Italy. Well, Italians probably have good reasons not to trust too much politicians and politics, but as a matter of fact, that's the lowest level. Again, so very broad differences. And what we summarize what we found with respect to the protest potential, which is what we are trying to grasp here, is that actually Italy and Spain stand out. Of course, these are also the countries that have been touched more strongly by the crisis. We don't have Greece, which would have been a nice case to see whether it fits as well. Probably it does. But beyond that, actually, we think this is also related to something else than the economic crisis. But that's not the main thrust. Concerning Italy and Spain, actually found that there is larger protest potential for participation in demonstrations in these countries. People are less active in less confrontational political activities such as petitioning, and also in more innovative ones such as boycotting, political consumerism. So the trend I mentioned earlier, one of the 4 context aspects I mentioned earlier, it's true. It's more true for some countries than for these countries, for example. There is a stronger support for leftist values. There's a higher degree of alienation from the political system, lower levels of political interest and trust, narrower satisfaction with democracy, and so on. And also what we saw, and this might well be caused entirely or nearly so by the economic crisis, the political alienation has increased over time, actually. It was already difficult at the beginning, or low at the beginning, but it's even lower towards the end of the period, so the periods of the economic crisis. Okay, so this was only I would say, the context for our analysis. Now, some findings based on the protest survey data. I'm following actually the scheme, the conceptual framework that I showed. So we are going to look at the social structural basis or social characteristics of participants. We are going to look at, I don't remember the order actually, I have to say, at the relationship between institutional and non-institutional politics, then the channels of recruitment and pre-existing ties, so networks, dispositions, affective, cognitive, and finally the motivations, which is our final aspect, final variable, I would say. Concerning the structural basis, well, we have lots of data. For example, I can show you. I'm not sure I will go into this, but maybe some. But just to show you the kind of analysis. Actually, in the book, we do 2 kinds of analysis. One is more descriptive. This one is more descriptive. In this one, actually, what we do is that we take different variables pertaining to the aspects we want to grasp. So here you see gender, age, social demographics, basically, and then we have also class, occupation, of course, and then so socioeconomic status and so on, and we also have the values. And we look at how this varies across countries, across the cultural economic distinction, and across the occasional activist distinction, which is what we are most interested in. I have to say that although we have more figures for country variations, we are not discussing very much this, actually. I even think, as an afterthought, I even think that we could have left this out, actually, altogether. Whereas the other 2 aspects are more important. But perhaps let's simply try to summarize some of the main findings that we find in this analysis of the structural basis sorry, I forgot. This is one type of analysis. The second type of analysis is actually a series of regression models where we take the same predictors here and we want to explain determination to participate, so commitment actually. But I'm not showing this here. Because I think actually, as a matter of fact, I think the most interesting aspects are here actually in this descriptive analysis, which actually gives me a lesson, I would say, which I keep repeating to my students often, which is that actually sometimes the simpler analyses are those that gives you more interesting things rather than go to sophisticated modeling and stuff like that. And this confirms actually my idea. Anyway, if I try to summarize some of the findings based on both kinds of analysis, as a matter of fact, what we find is that and this is an important finding, I think, which strengthens what others have done, is that we find persisting inequalities in protest participation. Of course, there is a discussion in general about inequalities in political participation, voting, of course, but also other forms. Here we are focusing on protest participation. There is also big inequalities in protest participation, so in this specific form of political participation, and even more specifically, actually, in participating in street demonstration, which is this paradigmatic or modular form of participation. So today, street demonstrations tend to overrepresent the middle classes and underrepresent the working classes. And then I will show you some differences, maybe. So there is this. Of course, it depends. Of course, it depends on the kind of movement. That's why we distinguish between two old and new movements. But as overall, middle classes actually are still the main profile of the protester, I would say. In some countries, actually, unemployed are a bit overrepresented. I think Italy is one of them. Perhaps only Italy, don't remember. While in other countries they don't participate at all. Men tend to be overrepresented in many countries, but actually in other countries it's the other way around. So that's also an interesting. And then I think that's also important because, I mean, research and we, myself at least, tend to, when dealing with the characteristic of protester, we tend to sort of generalize, implicitly to say, okay, women participate less, women participate more, middle class people, rich people, young. Okay, that's true, but that's the result of an aggregation of different data in different countries. If you, again, disaggregate at least by country, you can find different patterns, which I think is important, which then must be explained, of course, which we don't do here, but it's important. The more highly educated research-rich individuals are more active, as I said. This is based actually on the distinction between occasional and active. We also find that the 60s, 70s generation is still the most active, which is shown in the literature as being particularly active in protest activities. It's still the most active in most countries. Although the 2000 generation is also very active. Young people, they are very young people actually. They are coming up actually in the protest sector. Of course, the climate strikes are the most prominent example we have recently of very young people participating in demonstration of other protest activities. At the same time, we find that the social bases have widened considerably since the times of the working class labor movements to include middle class professionals. So this actually, I cannot go into the detail again because there are so many things to discuss. But this is related to an idea that, again, exists in the literature, but on which I think I would like to work more, is the expansion of the potential, and not only the potential, the expansion of the reservoir of people protesting. So there are many different profiles of people protesting today, much more than there was like 30 years ago, let's say. This is something that I think should be further supported with evidence, of course, but I think this is one of the main trends. If we think about trends and changes in protest characteristics, I think one of the main is that the inclusion of broader layers of the society into the protest sector. But I think this is one. More research-poor groups tend to be more likely to engage in demonstrations over economic issues rather than cultural issues. Not sure what does this means, but this is one of the findings. And finally, in order to overcome the higher barriers to participation, the people or the individuals from these groups, so this richer, etc., tend to, the groups that do engage end up being particularly committed. So this is the distinction between the occasional and the activist. Maybe just to point out some findings which are perhaps interesting without going into the interpretation. I will leave this to you. But for example, if you look at gender, we see a big difference actually across the two types of demonstrations. Cultural, economic, actually this is male, so males, or men, are overrepresented in economic kinds of demonstration as compared to cultural demonstrations. Some other findings that might be worth mentioning, well, I don't even know, but maybe I can even. But here I see, well, I didn't say something that, but you captured the small stars here is, of course, the significant differences across the two groups. Huh? So these are based on comparisons of percentages of means and seeing whether there are differences across. So actually these tables can be looked in two ways actually. One is a more general ways to see whether we find many stars on many different aspects across cultural, economic, and across occasional and activists, which means that there was really a need to disaggregate because there is an important difference on many different aspects. And the other one is to look at a specific aspect and whether it changes across the two groups. So maybe here we can stick with the first. There are some aspects that changes and some that don't. And here the same, we have the values. We use this distinction between left-right values, libertarian and authoritarian, so Kitchell's kinds of values. And maybe here the only relevant thing that I can stress is that actually values are important for participating, as we know, in protest. No, the left libertarian tend to protest more. That's basically a summary of what the literature says. True. But at the same time, values are even more, actually sometimes much more important when we look at a particular type of activists. So values are related, if I put it differently, values or the importance of values is related to strongly committed participation in protest activities and less committed or less engaged protest. Of course, they still matter. We don't see it here. We see it in the regression analysis. But it's important to make this distinction, at least we think. So left, right, libertarian, authoritarian, and then a scale. I'm not explaining every single. So maybe this was not the most interesting part. I think the most interesting comes after that, and maybe the most important, at least, I would say, is this aspect related to the relationship between institutional and non-institutional politics. I think in the literature there are actually two theses that confront each other. One is the thesis of the conflict or the competition between the two forms. That is, either you participate in institutional means, voting mainly, or you participate in protest activities. So one goes to the, how do you say it in English, to the detriment to the other. The other thesis, which has been stressed, for example, again by Pippa Norris, Russell Dalton, and others, is the thesis of the complementarity of institutional and extra-institutional participation. That is, one reinforces the other. And this is actually what we mostly find, actually, since we find that participants in demonstrations are also more likely to be involved in institutional modes of engagement. So protest does not go to the detriment of voting, let's say. But both forms, they strengthen each other. Again, confirming what some say, but others say the opposite, actually. This means that actually it is therefore unlikely that those people that are shying away from voting will turn to protest instead, precisely because protest and voting tends to reinforce each other, to complement each other at least. So it means that we have actually in society people that participate, a group of people that participate in different ways, and then you have another group, probably larger, that do not participate at all in any different forms. I think this is an important implication for, well, for democratic theory, of course, for discussions about democracy, and for discussions about political equality and inequality. So I think this is one of the most, to me at least, interesting aspects of the. So this suggests that declining turnout in other modes of institutional participation is still concerning, since engagement in ex-institutional is unlikely to be filling this gap in voting. Precisely because the two are complementary and not. We also find that while institutional and less costly modes of extra-institutional participation, such as petitioning and consumer politics, are more closely aligned with protest on cultural issues, more radical modes of action such as striking and direct action are more closely aligned with economic objectives. Put it differently, economic issues calls for more radical kinds of mobilizations, while cultural issues are more related to softer ways of protesting, I would say. Again, I don't know what this means. I mean, this means something. I'm not going to deal with this, but for us, it's important to acknowledge at least, and this is what we try to do in the book. We only do a first step of acknowledging that there are many differences if we zoom in on protesters more specifically, and we compare across not only protesters but across issues and movements. Therefore, we find many differences across these issues as well. We find similarities, of course, as well, but in this case we find a difference. Then we find that all modes of action were practiced more by activists than by occasional demonstrators, which is probably obvious. And we also find, which strengthen this idea of the complementarity of institutional and extra-institutional forms of participation, that party identification is closely aligned with political commitment in the name of a cause. So actually people who protest tend to be strong party identifiers, so which means that, again, there is a strong relationship between the two. It's not that you have people who identify with the party, who vote, but they don't do other forms, but they also do protest and the other way around. In other words, actually, what Banz and Case used to call the protesters, they don't exist, let's say, in the sense that protester for them was people only protesting and not voting, or they are not the majority at least. Okay, I'm not sure. Here is just the table. I think I don't have time to go into the table, and it's become a little bit annoying perhaps. But anyway, if you want to take a look, we can come back later on this. So I'm just skipping. Here you can simply see actually, again, I would say the relevance of this distinction. Because actually you see that what I just said is true in general, but is especially true for those people whom we call activists. That is, those people who participate regularly in demonstrations. It's probably one of the main messages, I would say, of the analysis, which is to say, features of protest, explanatory factors of protest that have been stressed in the literature hold on our data for all the protesters, but they hold especially for some kinds of protesters, those that protest on a regular basis, and not so much for those who are what we call first-timers here, or what Palgrave called first-timers. Mobilizing structures, so to try to finish in a 10, 15 minutes. Mobilizing structures. Again, we find confirmation of what exists in the literature. For example, that demonstrators are strongly embedded in different sorts of organizations. This has been shown in the literature on social movements, and also in the literature on political participation, the famous civic voluntarism model by Verba, Schlossman and company, Brady and others, stress very much the role of pre-existing ties and embeddedness in different kinds of organizations, not necessarily political organizations, of course. We also find stronger involvement in partisan unions of those who demonstrate more often, again, our activists. So again, this idea of the role of being embedded in some organizations and how this connects to participation, to protest participation, is true in general, but is especially true for those who are more active. This might be perhaps a bit more obvious than some other findings. The third point is one of the aspects or the findings that I like more, actually, because I think they open up avenues for further research. The importance of the more traditional organizational and interpersonal, that is, direct ties, these traditional organizational and interpersonal ties are more important for protest participation than indirect media channels or online social networks. And this is, again, is especially true for the most active participants. I think this in general is a nice finding because, I mean, at least I have heard a lot, including in academic work, in journalism, of course, but in academic work, a lot about this idea of transformation, which I mentioned myself, I have to say at the beginning, but the transformation of the protest, of the ways of protesting and the ways people are recruiting to protest, where the media and especially the new social media that are becoming increasingly important. It's probably true, but still the traditional face-to-face, I would say, interaction are what matter most, I would say. And again, especially for active participants. For the most active participants, furthermore, we find that being asked by co-members of an organization, of which they are members, it's the most important channel of demonstration, channel of recruitment, sorry, to demonstrations. And this is more important than for occasional demonstrators who rely more on the media. So, with respect to what I just said, the media, well, in general, direct ties, pre-existing ties and networks are still very important. The media, they became, of course, important as well, but they became important especially for some kinds of protesters, not for all, and especially for those who are more occasional, who rely more on the media, probably because they are less well embedded in previous traditional ties, which explain why. In the chapter, actually, in this analysis of the structural or mobilizing structures or the structural networks and ties, we also test through the regression analysis different accounts of protest participation, or to be more accurate in this case, of commitment to participation. And we test actually structural accounts based on networks. We test psychological accounts and rational choice accounts, mainly based on what I called dispositions before. And we found actually, in sort of ecumenic way, that they all matter to some extent, actually. So you cannot say that structural aspects, these are the most important. They are all important to some extent. So I'm not showing the findings here unless I find something particularly. Well, there are some interesting findings, but it will take too much time to look at. Yeah, maybe only this one. Anyway, I don't find it anymore, but anyway, it's not so important. I summarize the main finding. So moving to predispositions and then ending with motivations. As I said, we analyze different kinds of predispositions, what we call cognitive and what we call affective. So political attitudes on one hand, especially political interest, political efficacy, political trust. Political trust and political efficacy, it's particularly important because they relate to the discussion about what people nowadays call the critical citizens. As you might know, in the literature on political participation, there is this idea that actually there is a group of people in society which are called the critical citizens, which are quite distrustful of political institutions and of traditional representative democracy. But at the same time, this doesn't mean that they are alienated from politics, because they are at the same time very much interested in politics, not in the politique politicienne, as the French says, but in politics as the fact of being engaged in collective decision-making, so in participatory forms, actually, or even deliberative forms. And therefore, they display high levels of political interest, although they are very mistrustful of institutions, and especially they also display a very strong sense of political efficacy. And this is exactly, I mean, since Gamson in '68, actually, the literature on social movements has been showing that actually the combination of low level of trust and high levels of political efficacy is perhaps one of the mixes that better explain participation in protest activities. And again, we find, and this is true, when we are trying to explain commitment to participation, but at the same time, we also show that this is especially true for some of the demonstrators, which again are the most regularly participating. So to sum up maybe some of the, and try to conclude soon, to sum up some of the ideas of the findings based on predispositions. Find that people who take part in demonstration, they stand out for their particularly high interest in politics, which is quite obvious, but also for their critical stance towards political institutions, as I said, as well as towards conventional politics and how democracy works in their country. But at the same time, as I said, they have a heightened or strong sense of political efficacy, internal, external, individual, collective. We make this distinction, actually, this double distinction in our analysis between internal and external efficacy, which is traditional. It's a traditional distinction in political science, of course, or some actually use the terms of efficacy versus cynicism. And also we distinguish between individual or collective. Individual is more the idea that my own involvement in protest, in demonstration can matter. Collective is more we as a movement, we may matter actually. Social movement scholars have often been doing this distinction. So we also found that those who participate, as I said, on a regular basis are more, so our activists are more critical than those who do so more sporadically, and therefore they better correspond to the critical citizens depicted in the literature. So these are those critical citizens composing the core group of demonstrators. Then we find also, and this is the second part of the analysis of predispositions that we do on emotions, which doesn't actually, I think, yield fundamental findings, I would say. Not that the others are really fundamental, but these are even less so. Activists are also more emotionally charged, and we found actually a significant effect of emotion, I have to say, in our analysis. Different type of emotion, in particular anger, worry, frustration, which as a political opportunity theorist, I'm never quite happy to see that frustration has a significant effect. But anyway, we find that it has an effect, but we also find that this is particularly important, again, for the activist. The activist, or these more critical citizens, are particularly angry, are particularly worried, and are particularly frustrated about the issues they are dealing with, either economic or cultural. Again, here is the table that shows you what I just said. I'm not going into the detail, but I can give you the slides if you don't want to buy the book. Another table, here the emotions. And lastly, motivations, which is also, I think, an interesting aspect, and the social psychology literature has been working a lot on motivations. There are different kinds of motivation. As you know, we use existing distinction between, for example, instrumental and expressive motivations. We have a specific question in the questionnaire, in the CCC project, the questionnaire, which tackles this distinction. So instrumental versus expressive, and individual versus collective kinds of demonstrations. So the question, I don't remember exactly, but it's about expressing their views, I can tell you. Okay, I can tell you, these are the motivations, the specific motivations or indicators we have in the questionnaire. The question was, why are you there, basically? Why do you protest? To defend my interests, to express my views, to pressure politicians for change, to raise public awareness, to express my solidarity, or because I felt morally obliged to do so. And this then we categorize as individual or collective, as instrumental, or as expressive. And we found actually that expressing views, maybe going against rational choice accounts, I don't know, but expressing views, but also pressuring politicians for change, and expressing solidarity are the most popular motivations. So most of the people protesting, they protest because they want to express their views, mainly. Then, of course, they try to put pressure on the politicians for change, but they are also protesting for expressing solidarity. Expressive and collective motivations are or tend to be slightly more central, more important, but again, a little bit ecumenically, all aspects matter to some extent. So actually, when you ask people, why they are protesting, people come up with a wide range of different motivations, actually, which, again, I think goes in the idea of trying to disaggregate the group of protesters. Some protesters not only are different from others in many different ways, but they are also motivated by different things than others. In this chapter, we also tackle the role of collective identity, and we try to connect actually motivation with collective identity, collective identification, and we find as social movement scholars, of course, we are happy that we find confirmation of the central role of collective identities and identification for explaining commitment to protest, and especially politicized identity as underpinning individual motivations to engage in protest actions. And again, just quickly, again, the most important, I've lost my cursor here, but anyway. Again, we can see that actually if we compare the last two columns, we see significant differences actually between occasional and activists. So all the motivations, they are more important for activists, for regular participants than for occasional activists. We also found actually some differences across cultural and economic, but here only in some of the kinds of motivation. For example, people participating in economic demonstrations, they are more often there because they want to defend their interest than in cultural, which is quite understandable, I would say. Whereas people protesting in cultural demonstrations are more often doing so because they want to raise public awareness on certain issues, like climate change, for example, just to mention one. Okay, to sum up the study and perhaps what I said, I think I can stress, or I would like to stress, 4 aspects that we found. First, context matters, we know. National context, but, and this is most important for us here, also what we call the issue context matter. The context of demonstration is very important, and this is something that has been not forgotten, but quite neglected in the literature. So the issues you are mobilizing around also is important to explain who is mobilizing, why are they mobilizing, how they came there, how they were recruited, what are their affective and cognitive predisposition, their political attitudes, their emotions. So the issue context has been largely neglected. I think it has or should be put more at center stage. Second point of probably related to what I just said. Oh no, that's the other aspect. The explanatory factor and the micro-mobilization dynamics, they play out differently depending on the level of activism of participants in demonstration. So that's the distinction between occasional and activists. So it's important, therefore, to go beyond the participant versus non-participant distinction, which remains important, obviously. But it's important also to zoom in on more on participants and look and disaggregate those and look at variations within the group of participants. Here we did it in a simple way, perhaps even trivial way, I don't know, between occasional and activists. But you can do it differently also. You can disaggregate according to different criteria, which I encourage you to do actually in your own work. Third, I mentioned before, we actually conclude broadly that structure, culture, and rationality all matter to some extent. So explanation of protest participation or commitment to participate that focus solely on one factor, I think they miss something, though. We should include, as actually social movement scholars do quite often, structural factors relating to previous embeddedness in networks, for example, or the social position of the people, etc., etc. Cultural aspect, including emotions, why not? And rationality, so the decisions, the attitudes, and so on, they all matter to some extent. Some factors are more important than others, but they all matter. Some factors are more important for some demonstrators in some issues, but they all matter. And finally, and that's probably the most original part, at least that's what Crisi said in the praise to the book, because he said that the study not only confirms much of the received wisdom about protest politics, which is what I told you now, but also points to some subtle transformations. And I like to stress three of the transformation that I don't know if we show them, because of course, methodologically, we don't have longitudinal data, so per se, we cannot show transformation. We can either compare what we found with previous works on previous studies, which often are non-existent on this kind of data, or we can speculate actually about this development, these changes, which is what we do. And I summarize this as a blurring of the boundaries between and beyond protest politics. And this means actually that we observe, this is what I said a while ago, some minutes ago, we found, or at least let's put it this way. We hypothesize at the end that there is a pluralization. This we can show a little bit, actually, as a matter of fact. There is a pluralization of participants in street demonstration, a broader range of profile of people today participate in demonstration than it was the case 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Of course, we don't have strong evidence to show this. This should be, and again, I invite you to do this if you work on these things. It should be supported by more evidence. We also found some indication of a blending of cultural and economic issues. This relates to one of the ideas that actually I wrote in an article with another colleague, Nina Eggert, about this idea of what we call the homogenization of the field of contention. And we argue actually that in recent years, this distinction between old and new issues, old and new movement has become less relevant, if it was at all relevant before. Obviously, this is a matter of the glass half empty or half full. It depends how you see, because as I show you, we saw significant differences across the two, but we actually expecting more significant differences across old and new issues. And the fact that we don't found so many as we expected, the list, for us it's an indication, but again, we should work more on this, that there is such a blending of cultural economic issues. And I think actually, just to say one word more about this, I think the global justice, what people like Donatella, for example, call global justice movement, or the no global movement, some way responsible for this blending, or it has at least started this homogenization of protest, which has continued with the anti-austerity protest in the years of the crisis. But again, that's an hypothesis. And finally, a third one, which is more than an hypothesis, also because it's confirmed by other studies, is this is this overlap of institutional and contentious politics, where we put our hypothesis on the increasing overlap. We think that this overlap is increasing. I must confess, there is not evidence about this, so it's just a speculation. And this brings me to my last slide, because I wanted to say something about a book we still need to write, which is there since we finished this one. Actually, we finished this one more than 1 year ago. As you know, the process of publication is a long process. And this is some ideas of the new book. The Lorenzos, Lorenzo Zamponi at least, maybe remember that initially I planned to build all my presentation on this, but then I just come up that it would have been lasted 10 minutes because I don't have so much to say yet about, so I need to write the book first. But this, the book that we want to write now next is the book, it's a broader book that tries to conceptualize, hypothesize, and discuss and debate about some of the changes we think have characterized protest politics in the past 3 decades, and possibly find some empirical data supporting, not so systematically as we've done here because we don't have such data, but trying to take from existing studies, current studies, some data. And so far we came up with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They are not new again. There is nothing new here except perhaps this idea of the homogenization of protest, which I think is more innovative than others. But there are 6 changes that we think we want to discuss in the book. One is the idea of the normalization of protest. Well, Palgraf, Pippa Norris, and others have been writing this 20 years ago. Actually, the idea that I mentioned at the beginning, protest, particularly demonstrations, but protest in general, has been normalizing actually in the course of time. There are more protests. Protest has become more legitimate mean of action, etc. But there is also normalization of the protesters, which goes a little bit with the idea of homogenization, probably. That is, there are more people protesting than it was the case before. So we want to discuss this idea and try to show to what extent it's really true, and then dig a little bit deeper into it. The second one is the one I mentioned before, the homogenization, this idea that there has been an homogenization of the protest sector. The idea of the expansion, I think, is related to the idea that the repertoires of contention have expanded in recent years. We have a more varied range of activities today that are used, that are available to people to protest. You know, of course, the idea of Tilly's, of the action repertoire, that at some historical period in time you have a relatively limited range of means for contention, and we think that actually recently this new action repertoire has sort of expanded. So if I put myself in this tradition, would like to say, in addition to the transformation that Tilly has been discussing between the old and new repertoire, perhaps we are now witnessing a second major shift in the repertoires of contention. So this is one of the ideas. I don't know if it's true, I have to say, but it's just an idea that we would like to. Then there is the idea of the individualization of protests. I don't think we want to argue that there is a progressive individualization of the protest. I mentioned this at the beginning as a context, so now this is more individual, political consumerism, everyday life protests and stuff. But we want to discuss actually this. We want to, as others do, actually Michelle Micheletti in her work on political consumerism, she discusses also the idea whether these are really individual forms or they are perhaps individual to some extent, but they're also collective at the same time. So we want to discuss these things. The fifth is something that, for example, people like Lance Bennett and Segerberg have been studying in their book the logic of connective action, but many others have done. The digitalization, I don't know if this word exists in so the use of online sources. And as I anticipated, actually, I'm a bit skeptical about the impact. And so I think here we would like to discuss mainly the issue whether this is positive or negative for people protesting for movements. It has a positive impact, negative impact. Maybe positive, negative is not the correct word, but we want to discuss the consequences of this digitalization of society for protesting, which I think is still a little bit lacking, or there are studies, but I think we need more. And finally, another thing that we thought about is what for example, McCarran, Tarr, and Thiel in their dynamics of contention called scale shift. This mechanism or process, we never know if it's a process or mechanism, the scale shift. Again, we don't want to argue that there has been a scale shift from the local to the national, perhaps to the transnational, which is what most people say. Actually, there is this transnationalization of protest. Well, the global justice movement, of course, is the first. But we want to discuss and we want to raise the issue whether perhaps this scale shift is not also going the other way around. That is a renationalization of politics. Of course, in traditional politics, you do observe, or in political debates, you do observe this, no, with the populisms I don't know if in English it says, in Italian you say sovranismi. I don't know if in English it exists, the word. But so we want to discuss all these things. And of course, all these ideas have been inspired by the work that we've been doing in the street citizens, although not necessarily directly, but some of them, like the homogenization idea and so on. And I hope I'll be able to be invited once again in a couple of years, maybe, and I could present this, which perhaps will be more interesting. I don't know. Now, next summer will be difficult. I don't know if we can come up with something. It takes time to write. I don't have another sabbatical, so I cannot. So if you want to buy the book, you can. And thank you very much for your attention. I hope it was not too boring, too long.
Thanks a lot, Marco. I think you can immediately start with the discussion.
Thank you very much for a very fascinating presentation and very good findings from your book and your research. But what really struck me most when I listened to your presentation is the findings you made with regards to the relationship between institutional politics and that of what we call protest politics. I'm working on political participation on migrants in urban slums in Ghana, and it took me into the political participation literature. And one of the findings I saw was that there's a downward trend of participation as far as institutional politics is concerned. Yes, and in your earlier presentation, you alluded to that fact in the way of literature review, but your findings seem to suggest that institutional politics and, for example, voting and protest seems to be complementing each other. That is, if I get you right. Yeah, so I don't know whether that was based on, let's say, potential participation, or it was based on, let's say, previous participation. And if it is on potential participation, how did you deal with the issue of desirability? Because social desirability, people naturally want to give you answers that they think that you are expecting to get. So that is my take on it, my question.
I think it's better if you collect a few, otherwise, because we don't have time.
Okay. Thank you very much, Marco. I also like very much the talk, and I think this book will be a major contribution to the field. I had the opportunity to read and hear about some of the bits and pieces before, but haven't had the chance yet to look at the whole piece, but looking forward to. So two quick points. You stressed how probably you don't have a punchline, a great argument, or an overarching argument, but I think the main implication of this book is a warning, is an alert, especially against restricting the mobilization processes to a dummy, to a dichotomy of non-participation versus participation. And this is what these tables show. Especially, I think, or I like the fact that this difference between occasional and activist, or the intuition, I think, is that the occasional people I guess it's defined with people who participated less than 5 times, maybe, in protest, or I don't know which exactly the operationalization of that, probably that. Or, anyways, the important thing is that the intuition from here is that those occasional people resemble probably much more those who don't protest than those who do protest a lot, like the activists. And it's clearly an avenue for further inquiry, because I think the field will tether a lot. Many of the findings we have tether a lot when we subject this to empirical scrutiny. So simultaneously doing case control designs, so incorporating non-protesters, but also splitting by groups those who protest, as you do. And I think a lot of findings calls to attention or to empirical scrutiny in many of these findings. And actually you find them. So those who are occasional activists are not particularly left-wingers or are not, the findings in terms of class change. Also, regarding precisely this, the thing I didn't see throughout is whether you regress issue on type and type on issue. Especially because when you're looking at class, it was the first table of all of them. I think, yeah, that one. No, when you go to the anyways to the structural determinants, let's say, yeah, that one. Something that caught my attention is the role of class. So when you look at, especially as determinant of activists, but I wonder to what extent it is an effect in itself on the issue, you know? It could be, I think, that the economic protests, if you regress them on type of demonstrations, are picking up the effect of class in itself, and especially the interaction between class and issue. It's just a question whether you further explore it.
I answer, no?
Else? I should respond. Now you can.
I already forgot. Well, I start from here. Actually, in the regression, there might be a compositional effect. All these tables should be taken with some care, actually, because there could be a composition effect. In the regression, actually, in each regression, we control for types of demonstration and types of activists when we explain. So we have the result net of these factors, yeah, and country as well, actually. They are all 3 controls, actually. And as concerning what you said, I totally agree. Actually, these occasional, they mostly resemble the non-participant than the others. And I don't remember exactly the operationalization. The others, actually, I think it's simply, the activists are simply those that have been doing been participated in more than 2, simply, I would say, as far as I remember. But I can check. I mean, you could even disaggregate further within the activists, actually. Maybe I'm anticipating a criticism, which if I were at your place, I would have done probably. But, and I agree, actually, that perhaps in terms of design, the best design would be to have the non-activists, the sort of intermediate, and then the more frequent flyers, frequent participants, yeah. No, I totally agree with you. Was another question? Okay. And concerning, that was, yes, actually it's based, this idea of the relationship between institution and non-institution, no, it's based on the process survey data, not on the potential data. But of course, there you must rely on the question we have in the questionnaire. We distribute it to the people, which asks whether they have been voting or not. So, of course, you rely there, you must rely on their declared participation, obviously. Social desirability, yeah, but as in any other survey, I would say, and I don't have any reason to to suspect that there would not be, if any, a systematic bias that it cancels out in some way. So I'm not too much worried about I would say. But of course it's based, because when I said one of the answers to protest survey is that you capture people protesting, but then you still ask them questions, of course, and you still rely on what they say, obviously. So, yeah, the limitation is there anyway.
Josh?
Thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. I was just sort of wondering if you could explain a bit more about how you're saying that you thought a new repertoire was emerging. Then what sort of, if you could define that repertoire a bit more, because I understand that you did it all with protest analysis, but then it's all marches, so, and that's like a age-old repertoire. So I wonder if you could elaborate what you think the new repertoire looks like.
Yeah, no, simply, first of all, this is a first idea that we would like to develop in the next book, perhaps. Here we have studied demonstration, which is one specific activity of protest activities. There is a broader range, not only of protest activities, but also of other available means to participate in politics. There is vote, of course. There is political consumerism. There is engaging in associations. There is signing a petition. There is striking. And many others. And the idea that we have is, I don't know if we can call, maybe it's wrong to call this a transformation of the action repertoire. Action repertoire, I mean, the idea of Tilly is it's a set of culturally based, available and historically based available means that the citizens have at their disposal to participate or to make their voice heard, let's say. And so according to the idea of Tilly, these are quite limited, actually. There's not so many. And the idea that we have is perhaps not necessarily an idea of a new transformation, not like the one he depicted when he studied contentious French, for example, and showed how it has changed from the old to the new repertoire, which were totally different ways. It's more the idea of an expansion. The idea that we have is that today there are more means that are used, first of all, that are available, and especially that they are used by people than it was the case like 20 years ago. If only because you have the online, but also you have these more individualized ways. The question then is, of course, again, to disaggregate and to see whether the people that do, for example, political consumerism, they also do the other means, or whether there is a sort of specialization. This is something also that could be discussed. I have no clue, actually. I have no idea. I suspect if we go along this idea of complementarity of forms of participation, my take would be that there is complementarity also across other types of, that is, those who do political consumerism also tend to participate in demonstration and also tend to vote. And it's not like a specialization of different people of different group. But I don't know yet.
So thank you very much for your talk. You anticipate some of the questions that I had, but so the first one is if you distinguish, you mentioned that also disaggregating between activists, so not only occasional and activists, but what type of activists was a question that I would like to ask you, but also if you, because sometimes you spoke during your representation of first-timers and other time of occasional as if they were the same things. But did you also distinguish? So, because did you make a sort of analysis if the first-timers are different from the occasional. You can be an occasional, but without being a first timer. So, and if there are differences in this sense, then related to the last question and your last answer, I'm not sure that using the word activist in your differentiation between occasional and activist is the right choice. Or maybe I was wondering, for example, people conducting political consumerism without going in the street maybe would consider themselves as activists as well. So maybe I was just, it's just a matter of definition, but maybe protester in my, it sounded better. And then I lost, when you spoke about emotions, then you skipped the slide, if you can go back there, if there are differences between the cultural and the economic demonstration, because I mean, in my hypothesis, emotion would be much more important for the cultural than the economic ones. Thanks.
Thank you for your presentation. So I'm based in Prague, in the Czech Republic, in a country that is post-communist, and that's all apparently that is known about. Yeah.
Sorry.
My question is actually about your case studies. You chose countries that are really specific to a certain context and issue, so it's very Western European focused. So my comment maybe would be that with all the participations, mobilizations, and protests that we have in Eastern and Central Europe, it would be really helpful maybe for the next book to include these new movements, because I think you will find out about new practices, new repertoires, and all these other things. Thank you.
What you were answering to, like the question of Martin, but my question is regarding the disaggregation of the types of demonstrators and the issue of the demonstration. You say that you control the two with the regressions, but I wonder if you have investigated the disaggregation of the types of demonstration of demonstrators on the issues of demonstration, because that I think would be really interesting.
The effect of the type on the issue?
Yeah. And whether these, and then that would be like my suggestion for the new book, go in that direction, because you said that, and I think, I mean, the country comparison, I don't say that is not interesting, but is somehow like already like existing in the literature, where instead and is somehow like also what we are doing together with like in the Eureka project, like by the issue and then looking at different type of demonstrators, and here you have the material to look at that.
Okay, last call. You're two. If you're able to ask very quick questions.
Thank you. I was just wondering, regarding emotions, the ones presented in the table, are they all of the emotions you looked at? Because it's very, when you look at emotions, they're mostly segregated by pleasant and unpleasant emotions, and all of these anger, frustrations, worry, fear go into the category of unpleasant emotions. And then you disregard all of the pleasant emotions such as pride, happiness, which would then probably indicate a different type of participants, and I think it would go very different in a different way. So I'm just wondering if you thought about it, and how did you choose the unpleasant emotions?
Thank you. Yeah, my question kind of piggybacks on the back of that. In considering when you mention kind of political consumerism and potentially exploring that angle. I was wondering as well, that seems to be quite centred on individualism, and whilst you might have collective, like bulk buying, I think it can go beyond the consumption of collective action that might be more prefigured, but could come from this point of positive emotion where it's kind of the creation of utopias, and that wouldn't exactly fit in how you've kind of talked about things today. So just wondering about maybe considering in the future, it may be expanding that understanding of how people may have moved from protest to imagining a utopia through alternative means.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, here when I talk in this context about political consumerism, is that there's traditional boycotting indicator. Very limited, and we cannot deal with the interesting things that you. Maybe for the next, of course, it's much more simpler. About the emotions, again, actually, the choice of the emotion, these are all the emotions that we have in the questionnaire. The choice of the emotions were not dictated, were not done by us, because it was done by the project. I was involved in the project, so I'm a bit responsible as well, but it's collective responsibility. And truly, these are more, negative than positive. Actually, there is a distinction. It is based on the literature mostly electoral, actually, in social psychology, or in political psychology, rather. They make the distinction between avoidance and approach emotions. And the two of these actually are approach emotions, and two others are avoidance, meaning that the psychologists, actually, political psychologists, they think that some kinds of emotion, they push you away from political participation, while others, they are more attracting you to participation. And that's what we wanted to grasp here. I have to say that in the recent application of this method in the 15 March climate strikes I mentioned, we actually, I think, as far as I remember correctly, we have a much longer and broader range of emotions, including more positive ones, as far as I remember. And also, actually, because in the Eureka project, which is a project, European project, on youth political participation, we also have a question of emotion, as far as I remember, and we have many more items, which is important. No, we didn't do this distinction. I will come back to the Czech Republic. This distinction between. Combining the cultural, economic, occasional activists, it's a very interesting aspect, but we didn't do this. It was already a lot, actually, we thought. Well, the only thing that we treat them as in the regression as separate variables for controlling, but we are not looking more deeply. But it certainly would be something that, that provides and yields interesting findings, I would say. Including findings supporting or not the idea of disaggregating and looking. I agree. The Czech Republic, okay, but we excluded actually we also have Mexico in the data set, I think. We also excluded Mexico, also, again, in order to sort of homogenizing the field of comparison and to focus on the countries we know best. I have to say that in the book, I think in the book, the edited book I mentioned in the beginning, which Maria and I also co-edited, when in the comparative analysis there, I think the Czech Republic is included, the data on the Czech Republic there. So this is called Protest and Austerity. I think it's focusing on austerity, mobilization. And there we include actually the Czech Republic. Was there also a question? I don't remember that you asked. No? Okay. Mi sono dimenticato. But the occasional activists, we discussed a lot about the labels actually, including the labels for cultural, economic. New, old, and in the end we decided to call them activists. I think actually that decision was also sort of marketing decision, because I remember, I think we discussed with the people at Cambridge, and they said activists, I mean, you have in the title No, activism in the age of mobilization, so it's good to have activism also there. I can tell you how we operationalize actually the two. This is based on the number of demonstrations in which people have taken part in the last 12 months to Control for Age, actually. We define as occasional demonstrators all those who said that they not attended other demonstration in addition to the one in which they were served, first-timers. So occasional first-timers. I think we have a sort of implicit assumption that first-timers is a proxy for occasional. We don't know if it's true with it. And the other ones are all other respondents. So going back to what I said before, you could even disaggregate between those who have participated twice and those maybe who have participated. Although in the last one, because we had two questions in the questionnaire, in the last 12 years, how many demonstrations you have participated in the last 12 months or ever? So we didn't use the ever, of course, because otherwise the age is embedded in the operationalization. But then you asked something different as well, no?
And yeah, the last one was in the same line of the question about emotions. So if you also disaggregate the emotions, because
there you see the small stars, so you see that there are differences.
Yes.
We don't make much of this. We didn't know exactly what this means, I have to say. We wanted to include also emotion because actually this is one of my chapters. So I like the idea of cognitive affective predisposition, so we needed emotions to but yeah, there are differences actually, both across demonstrations and across types of, which is, goes of the blurring of the... we didn't hypothesize like this, I don't think so. Oh, that's your, it goes against your hypothesis, yes. Okay. Maybe we say it, I don't remember. There was another one, no? No? Someone else has asked a question before? No?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Marco, for the presentation. Thanks to everyone for the discussion. We have now a bit earlier than usual our lunch break, and we reconvene here at 2 for the paper discussions. Thank you, everyone.
Poi dopo siamo qui ancora.